Bernini is not just an architect, he is a gifted sculptor, and he's primarily known as a sculptor. His work really embodies the Italian Baroque spirit. He's known for imbuing lifelike flexibility into his work. And his images are often expansive and surprisingly theatrical, a characteristic of a lot of Baroque art. Here we're going to be looking at his image of David. And by the way, let me remind you, this is definitely not the first Italian image of David that we've seen. Now, this will predate his work at St. Peter's. Here, Bernini has chosen to depict the moment of combat itself, as opposed to Donatello's David, which shows a moment of victory, having beheaded Goliath, or Michelangelo's David, who is pondering the combat to come, but hasn't actually drawn any weapons. So it's a very different moment. But think about the sculptor's problem here. I'm trying to depict an entire narrative in a single image, because you really don't see, once we get past Gaberte, etc., with the Gates of Paradise, you don't see multiple narratives in sculpture, at least not in freestanding sculpture. So what he's doing here is showing us David at the beginning of a violent pivoting release, a bag of stones at his hip, perhaps suggesting that he thought it might be a longer fight. This moment suggests both the moment and the story as a whole. You can't look at it and not imagine David himself in the fight. Here he's focusing on an unseen Goliath, thereby invading the viewer's space. Very similar to Michelangelo's idea of depicting David sort of pondering the combat that is to come, looking beyond us to Goliath. Further, the intense concentration on his face contrasts vividly with the classical depictions of, for example, Donatello, and is more emotional than even Michelangelo's David. The facial tension augments the dramatic impact of the work. Now, let's look at this and start really tearing it apart. What we have is our marble sculpture. We have the bag of stones here at his hip as if he's ready to use them. He's got the sling. He's ready to use that. This is a great depiction of a sling. And by the way, look at the amount of detail that he has to put into it. This is a solid strap carved of stone that has to be self-supporting. Quite a feat given sculpture at the time. And he's creating something that's realistic. He's trying to tense the correct muscles for the movement, for where this figure is. Now, why isn't it as well known? Well, arguably because it exists in Rome rather than existing in Florence. It doesn't have the ties that we do in modern day society to the Italian Renaissance. After all, coming into this class, you probably have all seen Michelangelo's David, but how many of you were, shown, if nothing else, Bernini's David? It's not something that we tend to see on a regular basis. So we get a lot of ideas of why this might be lesser known. When we compare the three, the ideas are very different. Bernini is not trying to depict the perfect male nude, which Michelangelo is doing. He's not trying to depict a nude youth for the first time in since the classical world, which Donatello is doing. He's trying to show combat. And arguably the reason we don't know Bernini as well is we don't like to think about the moment of combat. Even soldiers, even veterans, we talk about how they must be stoic and prepared going into combat and how they must recover and be victorious coming out of combat. But we don't often show the moment of combat itself. You don't see a lot of war images of combat taking place, at least not artistically speaking. So that could also be an issue. We don't like that muddy period. We don't want to think about the actual bloody, gory details of what goes into the story. We'd rather think about the characters going in or the characters coming out victorious. We like the hero's journey. We don't like that middle part. But Bernini also shows us the gory details of it. it lacks some of the subtleties that we have with the other pieces. For example, he tries to cover David's manhood, but does so in this very unusual and awkward way, almost as if the cloth is going the wrong way around, as if when he swings and throws, he's going to suddenly be uncovered. So there's a lot going into this. It's a very complex image, but it's not the most famous image of the David for any number of different reasons.